"I'll never leave you," she whispered to the wounded Apache after dragging him from the raging river, words that would ignite a war between conscience and survival, between a woman's promise and a town's prejudice. In the unforgiving territory of 1874 Arizona, the spring floods of 1874 came early to Copper Ridge, Arizona territory, turning the usually docile Verde River into a churning beast that swallowed everything in its path. Lucy Ann Dalton stood at the edge of her small homestead that grey March morning, watching brown water surge past cottonwoods that had stood for decades, their massive trunks now bending like wheat stalks in a storm. She clutched her woolen shawl tight against the mountain wind, her calloused hands testament to 3 years of working this harsh land alone since her husband Samuel had died in the mine collapse. The roar of rushing water drowned out all other sounds, but Lucy's keen eyes caught something that made her heart stop. A dark shape tumbled in the violent current, spinning helplessly between jagged rocks and fallen timber. At first glance, it appeared to be another uprooted tree, but then she saw an arm break the surface, fingers grasping desperately at nothing. Without hesitation, Lucy kicked off her heavy boots and plunged into the icy torrent, her muscles screaming as the current tried to sweep her downstream. The water was so cold, it felt like liquid fire in her lungs, and every instinct told her to swim back to safety. But those fingers, still visible above the foam, belonged to someone who would die if she turned away. Fighting against the river's fury, Lucy reached the struggling figure and found herself face to face with a young Apache warrior, his long black hair plastered against his bronze skin, blood streaming from a deep gash across his forehead. His dark eyes met hers with a mixture of pain and fierce pride, even as consciousness flickered like a dying flame. This was Kuruk, though Lucy didn't know his name yet. A skilled hunter and tracker whose reputation among both his people and the white settlers was built on honor and deadly accuracy with both bow and rifle. The current slammed them both against a partially submerged boulder, and Lucy felt her ribs crack under the impact. Kuruk's weight threatened to drag them both under as she fought to keep his head above water. Her dress, heavy with river water, wrapped around her legs like chains. But Lucy had spent her childhood swimming in these same waters before they turned violent, and she knew every bend and eddy of the Verde River. She also knew they had perhaps 30 seconds before the current would sweep them into the rapids that had claimed 3 lives the previous spring. Using every ounce of strength in her compact frame, Lucy managed to angle their bodies toward a fallen cottonwood whose branches still held fast to the riverbank. The bark tore at her hands as she grabbed hold, blood mixing with river water. Kuruk's eyes had closed, and she could feel his breathing growing shallow against her shoulder. "Stay with me," she gasped, though she knew he probably couldn't understand English. "I'll never leave you," she whispered, the words torn from her lips by desperation and something deeper than mere compassion. The next few minutes blurred together in a haze of pain and determination. Lucy hauled Kuruk's unconscious form through the shallows, her feet slipping on smooth river stones, her lungs burning from the effort. By the time she dragged him onto the muddy bank, her hands were raw and bleeding, her dress torn in a dozen places. She knelt beside him, checking for breath, for a heartbeat, for any sign that her desperate rescue had not been in vain. Kuruk's chest rose and fell in ragged gasps, and Lucy felt a wave of relief wash over her. But as she examined his injuries more closely, her heart sank. The head wound was deep, requiring immediate attention, but more concerning was his left leg, which lay at an unnatural angle. The bone was clearly broken, possibly in multiple places. Without proper medical care, infection would set in within days. And Lucy knew that the nearest doctor, old Doc Harrison in Copper Ridge, would rather see an Apache die than set foot on her property to treat one. As if summoned by her thoughts, the sound of hoofbeats approached through the morning mist. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their faces grim beneath the brims of their worn hats. Lucy recognized them immediately. Sheriff Tom Bradley, his deputy Jake Morrison, and Will Harper, whose cattle ranch bordered her property. They had been patrolling the flooded areas. looking for stranded livestock and assessing damage to the town's outlying properties. Sheriff Bradley dismounted first, his weathered face hard as granite as he took in the scene before him. He was a man who had survived the Apache Wars, who bore scars from raids and battles that had claimed the lives of friends and neighbors. His hand instinctively moved to the Colt revolver at his hip when he saw Kuruk's still form. "Lucy, step away from that savage," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of law and the weight of old hatred. "You don't know what he might do when he wakes up." Lucy rose to her feet, water still dripping from her sodden dress, her chin raised in defiance. She had known Tom Bradley since she was a child, had even considered him something of an uncle figure after her parents died. But the man looking at her now was a stranger, his eyes cold with suspicion and something that looked almost like betrayal. "His name is not Savage, Tom," she said quietly. "He's badly hurt and he needs help." Deputy Morrison spat into the mud beside his horse. "Help is the last thing that Apache needs, Mrs. Dalton. You know what his people did to the Henderson family last month. You know what they did to your own husband's mining crew 2 years back." His voice carried a venom that made Lucy's skin crawl. Morrison was young, barely 25, but he had seen enough frontier violence to harden his heart against mercy. Lucy felt anger flare in her chest, hot and righteous. "My husband died in a mine collapse, Jake Morrison, and you know it. Don't you dare use Samuel's memory to justify letting an injured man die." She moved protectively between the men and Kuruk's unconscious form. He was drowning in that river. I wasn't going to stand by and watch a human being die when I could do something about it. Will Harper. The rancher had remained silent during this exchange, but now he urged his horse closer, his lined face troubled. He was older than the other two men, old enough to remember when Apache and white settlers had sometimes lived in uneasy peace before the wars and the hatred had poisoned everything between them. "Lucy, girl, you got a good heart," he said slowly. "But you don't understand what you're getting yourself into. That there is Kuruk, son of Chief Nalnish. He's wanted for questioning in connection with the raid on the silver mine transport 3 weeks ago." The name hit Lucy like a physical blow. She had heard of Kuruk, of course. Every settler in the territory knew the stories of the young Apache warrior who could track a man across solid rock, who could put 3 arrows in a target at 100 yards, who had never been captured despite the bounty on his head. But looking at him now, unconscious and vulnerable, bleeding onto her property, she saw not a legend or a threat, but simply a young man who would die without help. Sheriff Bradley's patience was wearing thin. "Lucy Ann Dalton, I'm ordering you to step aside. We're taking this Apache back to town for questioning, assuming he lives long enough to answer for his crimes." His hand was now resting openly on his gun grip, and Lucy realized with a chill that he was prepared to use it if necessary. "He can't be moved," Lucy said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Look at that leg, Tom. Look at the head wound. If you put him on a horse in this condition, you'll be hauling a corpse to your jail." She took a step forward, her wet boots squelching in the mud. "Give me 3 days to get him stable enough to travel. 3 days, and then you can have your questioning." The 3 men exchanged glances, and Lucy could see the debate playing out in their expressions. Bradley clearly wanted to arrest or kill Kuruk on the spot. Consequences be damned. Morrison was eager to follow his sheriff's lead, his young face flushed with the prospect of violence. But Harper, the oldest and perhaps wisest of the 3, seemed to be weighing different considerations. 2 days, Harper said finally. "You get 2 days to patch him up enough to travel. But Lucy, I want your word that you won't try to help him escape. And I want your word that if he so much as looks at you wrong, you'll fire that signal shot we all agreed on." He gestured toward the old army rifle that hung over her cabin door. "Promise me that, and I'll convince Tom here to give you the time you're asking for." Lucy looked down at Kuruk's pale face, at the blood still seeping from his wounds, and felt something shift inside her chest. She was making a choice that would change everything, that would set her on a path she couldn't see the end of. But as she met Harper's weathered gaze, she knew she couldn't make any other decision. "I promise," she said quietly. 2 days. Sheriff Bradley mounted his horse with obvious reluctance, his face dark with frustration. 2 days, Lucy, but if that Apache so much as breathes wrong, if he tries to signal his war party, if he makes one move that looks like trouble, I'll be back with a posse and we'll finish this the hard way." He wheeled his horse around and started back toward town, Morrison following close behind. Will Harper lingered for a moment longer, his kind eyes full of concern. "Lucy, you're playing with fire here. That boy has killed white men, make no mistake about it. War changes people, turns them into things they never meant to be." He leaned forward in his saddle. "But I also know you, girl. You've got your daddy's stubborn streak and your mama's soft heart, and once you've made up your mind to help someone, nothing short of the second coming is going to stop you." Lucy managed a weak smile. "Thank you for talking them into the 2 days, Will. I know it wasn't easy." She glanced back at Kuruk, whose breathing seemed to be growing stronger. "Could you ask Doc Harrison to at least send some medical supplies? Bandages, laudanum for the pain, maybe some carbolic acid for the wounds?" Harper shook his head sadly. "Doc won't have anything to do with doctoring an Apache, Lucy. You know that. But I'll see what I can do about getting you some basic supplies without mentioning what they're for." He touched the brim of his hat in farewell. 2 days, girl. Don't make me regret talking Tom out of taking that Apache right now." As the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, Lucy found herself alone with her unconscious patient and the weight of her decision. She looked around her modest homestead, taking inventory of what she had to work with. Her late husband's medical supplies from his mining days were limited, but might be enough to clean and dress the wounds. She had some whiskey for pain and disinfection, clean cloth that could be torn into bandages, and her grandmother's knowledge of frontier medicine that had been passed down through 3 generations of strong women. The first order of business was getting Kuruk out of the mud and into shelter. Her cabin was small but warm, with a good fireplace and a sturdy bed where he could recover. Lucy retrieved a large canvas tarp from her barn and managed to roll the unconscious Apache onto it. Dragging him across the yard to her cabin was backbreaking work. But she had spent 3 years doing backbreaking work and was stronger than her small frame suggested. Inside the cabin, Lucy made quick work of cutting away Kuruk's wet buckskin clothing to examine his injuries properly. The head wound was indeed serious, a gash that ran from his left temple almost to his ear, but it appeared to be more bloody than life-threatening. The broken leg was a different matter entirely. Lucy had seen similar injuries in her husband's mining crew, and she knew that setting the bone properly would require skill, strength and no small amount of luck as she worked by lamplight, cleaning the wounds and preparing makeshift splints from firewood. Lucy found herself studying Kuruk's face. He was younger than she had expected, probably no more than 25, with strong, handsome features that spoke of good breeding and careful upbringing. His hands, when she examined them for other injuries, were calloused from hard work, but also bore the intricate tattoos that marked him as a full warrior of his tribe. Whatever else he might be, this was not some wild savage, but a man of standing among his people. The sound of Kuruk stirring brought Lucy back to the present. His dark eyes opened slowly, confusion and pain warring in their depths as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. When he saw Lucy kneeling beside him, her hands gentle but sure as she cleaned his wounds, his body tensed as if preparing for flight or fight. But the broken leg made movement impossible, and after a moment he relaxed slightly, his gaze never leaving her face. "Easy," Lucy said softly, her voice carrying the same tone she might use with a wounded animal. "You're safe here. You were hurt in the river, and I pulled you out." She continued working as she spoke, her movements careful and professional. "My name is Lucy Ann Dalton. This is my home, and nobody is going to hurt you here." Kuruk's lips moved slightly, and Lucy leaned closer to catch his words. When he spoke, it was in accented but clear English, his voice rough with pain and exhaustion. "Why?" he whispered, the single word carrying a world of confusion and suspicion. In his experience, white women did not risk their lives to save Apache warriors. In his experience, white settlers shot first and buried the bodies later. Lucy paused in her ministrations, meeting his gaze directly. It was a question that deserved an honest answer, even if she wasn't entirely sure she understood her own motivations. "Because you were drowning," she said simply. "Because I couldn't stand by and watch someone die when I had the power to help." She resumed cleaning the head wound, her touch gentle but thorough. "Because it was the right thing to do." The Apache warrior studied her face for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth behind her words. Lucy felt exposed under that scrutiny, as if Kuruk could see past all her defenses to the lonely woman beneath. Finally, he spoke again, his voice stronger now. "I am called Kuruk," he said. "I am in your debt, Lucy Ann Dalton." Lucy felt her cheeks flush at the formal way he spoke her full name, as if it were a title of respect rather than simply what she was called. "Just Lucy will do fine," she replied, returning to her work on his leg. The bone needed to be set properly, and she knew from watching Doc Harrison work on Samuel's crew that timing was crucial. "This is going to hurt something fierce," she warned, positioning herself to pull the leg straight. Kuruk's jaw tightened, but he nodded his understanding. Lucy had expected him to cry out when she pulled, had prepared herself for screams or curses in Apache. Instead, he simply gripped the edge of her quilt with white-knuckled hands and stared at the ceiling, a low grunt the only sound that escaped his lips. The bone clicked back into place with an audible snap, and Lucy quickly secured the makeshift splints she had prepared from split firewood and torn bedsheets. As she worked, Lucy found herself stealing glances at her unexpected patient. Everything she had been told about Apache warriors suggested they were brutal savages, men who took scalps and burned homesteads without mercy. But Kuruk bore himself with a dignity that reminded her more of the cavalry officers she had known, men who faced danger with courage and accepted pain without complaint. There was intelligence in his dark eyes, and something else that surprised her. A gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation as a feared warrior. "The men who came," Kuruk said quietly, as Lucy finished securing the splints. "They will return." It wasn't a question but a statement of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who understood the ways of frontier justice. "You have put yourself in danger by helping me. My people have a saying, the bear does not thank the hunter who frees him from the trap. For both know the hunter's village will blame him for the bear's escape." Lucy paused in her bandaging, struck by the wisdom in his words. She had always known that helping Kuruk would bring consequences, but she had been so focused on saving his life that she hadn't fully considered what those consequences might mean for her own future in Copper Ridge. The town had already viewed her with suspicion ever since Samuel's death, a lone woman trying to work a homestead without a man's protection. Now she had given them a real reason to question her judgment. "Maybe so," she said finally, meeting his gaze. "But I reckon I'll deal with those consequences when they come. Right now, you need rest and healing, and that's what matters." She moved to her kitchen area, pumping water into a basin to clean her hands. "Are you hungry?" "I've got some venison stew that's been simmering all morning." Kuruk's eyes widened slightly at the offer. In Apache culture, sharing food with a guest was a sacred obligation, but he had not expected such hospitality from a white woman, especially not one who had every reason to fear him. "You would feed an enemy?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Are you my enemy?" Lucy countered, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. The question hung in the air between them, more complex than either of them had expected. "Because right now, you look like a man who nearly drowned and needs help getting his strength back. Enemy is a word for people who are trying to hurt each other. And I don't see either of us doing that." Kuruk accepted the bowl, with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from weakness or emotion, Lucy couldn't tell. He ate slowly, savoring each bite as if he hadn't had a proper meal in days. "You are not what I expected," he said between spoonfuls. "The white women I have encountered either scream when they see me or reach for their husbands' guns. You do neither?" Lucy settled into a chair beside the bed, her own bowl of stew growing cold as she watched him eat. "And you're not what I expected either," she admitted. "The stories they tell in town make Apache warriors sound like demons straight from hell. But you speak English better than half the men in Copper Ridge, and you've got better manners than most of them too." A ghost of a smile crossed Kuruk's face. "My father believed that understanding one's enemies was the path to survival. He sent me to the mission school when I was young, before the wars began in earnest. The black-robed priests taught me your language, your numbers, your holy book." The smile faded. "They also taught me that many white men speak of peace while sharpening their knives." Lucy felt a pang of sadness at the bitterness in his voice. She had heard stories of the mission schools, of Apache children taken from their families and forced to abandon their culture in the name of civilization. The fact that Kuruk had survived such an experience and still retained his dignity spoke to a strength of character that impressed her more than any warrior's reputation could. "Not all of us are like that," she said quietly. "Some of us just want to live in peace, to work our land and raise our families without hurting anybody." She gestured around her modest cabin. "I've been out here 3 years now, and I've never had trouble with your people. Never even seen an Apache until today, except at a distance." Kuruk set down his empty bowl, his expression thoughtful. "This land was my grandmother's favorite camping place," he said, looking around the cabin as if seeing it with new eyes. "She used to bring me here when I was small, to gather the sweet grass that grows by the river. She said the water spirits were kind here, that they would protect anyone who showed them proper respect." The revelation sent a chill down Lucy's spine. She had chosen this particular spot for her homestead because it felt peaceful, because the river provided water and the meadow was perfect for her small herd of cattle. She had never considered that it might hold special meaning for the Apache people, that she might be living on what amounted to sacred ground. "I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I had known this place was important to your people, I would have chosen somewhere else to build." Kuruk shook his head slowly. "My grandmother is with the spirits now, and the sweet grass still grows. The land does not belong to any one people, only to itself. You have cared for this place, kept it clean and peaceful. I think the water spirits approve of you, Lucy Ann Dalton. Perhaps that is why they brought me here when I was drowning." The simple acceptance in his words brought tears to Lucy's eyes. She had expected anger, resentment, demands that she leave land that wasn't rightfully hers. Instead, Kuruk had offered understanding and something that felt almost like blessing. It was more grace than she had received from her own neighbors in the 3 years since Samuel's death. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the cabin windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Lucy realized that several hours had passed since the sheriff's visit, and she still had much to do if she was going to keep Kuruk alive and healthy enough to travel in 2 days. She needed to check his wounds regularly, make sure infection didn't set in, prepare enough food and medicine for the journey to town. But there was something else she needed to do first, something that had been nagging at her since she pulled Kuruk from the river. She needed to understand who he really was, what he was accused of, and whether the man lying in her bed was truly the dangerous outlaw the sheriff believed him to be. "Kuruk," she said carefully, choosing her words with deliberation. "Sheriff Bradley said you were wanted for questioning about a raid on a silver mine transport. He seemed to think you were involved in attacking white settlers." She met his eyes directly. "I need to know if that's true. Not because I'm planning to turn you over to them, but because if I'm risking everything to help you, I deserve to know who I'm helping." Kuruk was quiet for so long that Lucy wondered if he had fallen asleep. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain and bitter truth. 3 weeks ago, men wearing Apache war paint attacked a silver transport on the mountain road. They killed 2 guards and made off with a strong box containing several $100s. He paused, his dark eyes fixed on some distant memory. The tracks they left were deliberately obvious, meant to be followed. The arrows they used were not made by Apache hands. Lucy felt her heart sink. You're saying it wasn't really Apache who did the raid? I am saying that someone wanted it to look like Apache work, Kuruk replied. Someone who benefits when the army increases patrols in our territory. Someone who profits when settlers demand more protection from the savage threat. His voice carried a bitterness that spoke of hard-won knowledge. There are white men in this territory who have grown rich selling guns to the army and supplies to new settlements. War is profitable, Lucy Ann Dalton. Peace is not. The implications of his words hit Lucy like a physical blow. She had lived on the frontier long enough to know that some men did indeed profit from conflict, that there were those who stirred up trouble between Apache and settlers for their own gain. But she had never imagined that raids might be deliberately staged to justify continued military presence and federal spending. Can you prove any of this? She asked, her mind racing with possibilities. Do you have evidence that could clear your name? Kuruk's laugh was short and bitter. The word of an Apache against white accusers in your courts. He shook his head. My people have learned that white man's justice has little to do with truth and much to do with convenience. If they need someone to blame for the raid, an Apache warrior will serve as well as any other. Lucy felt a surge of anger at the resignation in his voice, at the system that could condemn a man based on assumptions rather than evidence. But she also felt something else stirring in her chest, a stubborn determination that reminded her of her father's stories about fighting injustice wherever he found it. Maybe, she said slowly, but you've got something most Apache don't have. You've got someone willing to speak for you, someone the townspeople know and trust. She leaned forward, her eyes bright with sudden possibility. I may just be a widow trying to work a homestead, but I've lived in this territory for 3 years. I know these people, know their ways. If there's evidence to be found, maybe we can find it together. Kuruk stared at her as if she had suddenly sprouted wings. You would risk everything you have built here to help prove my innocence? Why would you do such a thing? Lucy considered the question, trying to put into words feelings she didn't fully understand herself. Because, she said finally, if they can destroy you with lies and false evidence, they can destroy anyone. Today, it's an Apache warrior. Tomorrow it might be a widow who helped him. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. As the sun began to set outside her cabin windows, Lucy Ann Dalton made a decision that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone in Copper Ridge. She was going to do more than just nurse Kuruk back to health. She was going to find the truth about the silver mine raid, and she was going to make sure that truth was heard, no matter what the cost. Dawn came gray and cold to the Arizona territory, bringing with it the first test of Lucy's resolve. Kuruk had developed a fever during the night, his body burning hot to the touch as infection began to take hold in his wounds. Lucy had spent the dark hours alternating between cooling his forehead with damp cloths and checking his breathing, her own exhaustion forgotten in the face of his worsening condition. She knew that if the fever didn't break soon, all her efforts to save him would be for nothing. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent Lucy's heart racing as she peered through her cabin window. But instead of Sheriff Bradley's expected return, she saw a lone figure on horseback, moving slowly up the trail from town. As the rider drew closer, Lucy recognized Maria Santos, the Mexican woman who ran the boarding house in Copper Ridge and served as the closest thing the settlement had to a midwife and healer. Maria's weathered face was grim as she dismounted, carrying a leather satchel that Lucy hoped contained medical supplies. "Buenos dias, Lucy," Maria said quietly as she approached the cabin door. "I heard from Will Harper that you might be needing some help with doctoring." Her dark eyes held no judgment, only the practical concern of one healer for another. Maria had lived through enough frontier hardships to understand that survival sometimes required choices that others might not approve of. Lucy welcomed Maria inside with relief so profound it nearly brought her to tears. "He's burning up with fever," she said, leading the older woman to Kuruk's bedside. I've been trying to keep him cool, but I don't have enough medicine to fight the infection properly." She watched anxiously as Maria examined the unconscious Apache, her experienced hands checking pulse, breathing, and the condition of his wounds. Maria's expression was serious, but not hopeless, as she opened her satchel and began removing bottles and packages. "The head wound is healing clean, but this leg, it has the bad spirits in it," she said, mixing a poultice from herbs and roots that Lucy didn't recognize. "We must draw out the poison before it reaches his heart." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She worked with the efficiency of long experience, cleaning the wound with carbolic acid that made Kuruk moan in his unconscious state. "Why are you helping me with this, Maria?" Lucy asked as they worked together to apply the poultice and fresh bandages. "You know what people in town are saying about me harboring an Apache. You know it could bring trouble to your own business." Maria paused in her work, her lined face thoughtful. "My grandmother was Yaqui," she said simply. "She taught me that the spirits judge us not by the color of our skin or the language we speak, but by the kindness we show to those who need help." She resumed bandaging Kuruk's leg with careful precision. "Besides, I have seen this young man before in the town market. He came with his father under a flag of truce 2 summers ago, seeking medicine for sick children in his tribe. He could have taken what he needed by force, but instead he offered fair trade and spoke with honor. That is not the behavior of a savage." Lucy felt a surge of vindication at Maria's words, but also a growing sense of urgency. If Kuruk was indeed innocent of the charges against him, then someone else was responsible for the silver mine raid, someone who was content to let an innocent man hang for their crimes. The thought filled her with a cold anger that surprised her with its intensity. As they continued their medical work, Maria shared what she had learned in town about the investigation into the raid. "The army captain, he is pushing Sheriff Bradley to make an arrest quickly," she said, applying a cooling compress to Kuruk's forehead. "There is talk of bringing in Apache hunters from Tucson, men who are paid for every scalp they bring back. The captain, he does not care if the Apache they kill are guilty or innocent." The news sent a chill through Lucy's bones. Apache hunters were little better than murderers, men who killed for bounty money and asked no questions about guilt or innocence. If they were brought in, Kuruk would never live to see a trial, and the real perpetrators of the silver mine raid would escape justice entirely. "Maria," Lucy said, her voice low and urgent, "Kuruk told me he believes the raid was staged to look like Apache work, that white men were behind it for their own profit. If that's true, then we need to find proof before they bring in those hunters." The older woman's eyes sharpened with interest. "This would not surprise me," she admitted. "There are men in this territory who grow rich from conflict between Apache and settlers. They sell guns to the army, supplies to new homesteads, protection to frightened families. Peace would be very bad for their business." She finished tying off the bandage and sat back on her heels. "But proving such a thing, that would be very dangerous." Lucy felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders once again. She could play it safe, focus solely on healing Kuruk and getting him out of the territory alive. Or she could take the greater risk of seeking justice, knowing that failure could cost not only Kuruk's life, but her own reputation and safety. But as she looked at the unconscious Apache warrior, remembering his dignity and the intelligence in his eyes, she knew she had no real choice. "Tell me about the men who would profit from continued conflict," she said to Maria. "Who benefits most when the army increases patrols and the government sends more money for frontier defense?" Maria glanced around the cabin nervously, as if expecting hostile ears to be listening. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There is a man named Cornelius Blake who owns the trading post and the freight company. He has contracts to supply the army garrison, and he charges premium prices for goods delivered to isolated settlements. Then there is Judge Whitmore, who owns large parcels of land that become more valuable when the government offers homestead incentives to encourage settlement. Lucy nodded, filing away the names for future reference. Anyone else? Captain Morrison at the fort. He is up for promotion to major, but only if he can show that his leadership is needed to maintain peace in the territory, Maria continued. And there is talk that some of the mine owners have been hiring men to create troubles, so they can demand more army protection for their silver shipments. The picture that emerged was disturbing, but not entirely surprising. Lucy had lived on the frontier long enough to know that some men would exploit any situation for personal gain, even if it meant prolonging violence and suffering. But knowing who might be responsible and proving it were two entirely different challenges. A soft moan from the bed interrupted their conversation. Kuruk's eyes fluttered open, confusion and pain warring in their dark depths as he tried to focus on his surroundings. The fever had broken sometime during their medical work, leaving him weak but lucid. When he saw Maria beside his bed, his body tensed with alarm. "Peace, Kuruk," Lucy said quickly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This is Maria Santos. She's a healer, and she's here to help you get well." She saw the wariness in his eyes and understood it. Trusting one white woman was difficult enough for an Apache warrior. Trusting two was almost unthinkable. Maria seemed to understand his hesitation as well. She spoke to him in what sounded like a mixture of Spanish and Apache, her voice carrying tones of respect and reassurance. Kuruk listened intently, his expression gradually shifting from suspicion to cautious acceptance. When Maria finished speaking, he nodded slowly and relaxed back against the pillows. "What did you tell him?" Lucy asked, curious about the exchange. "I told him that my grandmother's people and his people were cousins long ago, before the white man came to divide us," Maria replied. "I told him that I honor the old ways of hospitality and healing, and that his secrets are safe with me." She began repacking her medical supplies. "I also told him that there are those in town who seek to use his name for evil purposes, and that we must be very careful." Kuruk struggled to sit up, his voice hoarse but determined. "The woman Lucy speaks truth about the silver mine," he said, his English careful but clear. "It was not Apache who did this thing. The tracks were made by shod horses, and the arrows were not crafted by my people's hands." He looked directly at Lucy. "But proving this to your authorities, it will require more than words." Lucy felt her pulse quicken with excitement and fear. "You have evidence, something that could prove your innocence." Kuruk nodded slowly. "Before the flood took me, I was tracking the real raiders. I followed their trail for 2 days, until the spring storms washed out the tracks. But I found something they left behind, something that would identify them to those who know how to read the signs." He attempted to rise from the bed, but fell back with a grimace of pain. "It is hidden in a cave near Eagle's Peak, about half a day's ride from here." Maria and Lucy exchanged glances, both understanding the implications immediately. If Kuruk had physical evidence that could identify the real raiders, it might be enough to clear his name and expose the truth behind the staged attack. But retrieving that evidence would require a dangerous journey into disputed territory, and it would have to be done before Sheriff Bradley returned to collect his prisoner. "I'll go," Lucy said without hesitation. "You can give me directions to this cave, and I can retrieve whatever evidence you found." Both Kuruk and Maria protested immediately. "Too dangerous," Maria said firmly. "A woman traveling alone in that country, it is asking for trouble from both Apache war parties and white raiders." She shook her head emphatically. "If this thing must be done, we need a better plan." Kuruk's dark eyes burned with frustration at his own helplessness. "The evidence means nothing if you are killed trying to retrieve it," he said to Lucy. "And if something happens to you, I am a dead man anyway. The sheriff will not wait for healing if his only witness disappears." Lucy felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on her. Every option seemed to lead to danger or failure, and time was running short. But as she looked around her small cabin, at the two people who had become unlikely allies in this desperate situation, an idea began to form in her mind. What if we don't have to go alone? she said slowly, thinking out loud. What if we could convince Will Harper to help us? He's got the authority to form a legal posse, and he's already shown some sympathy for our situation. She warmed to the idea as she spoke. If we could present him with enough evidence to suggest that the real raiders are still out there, he might be willing to investigate. Maria looked skeptical. Will Harper is a good man, but he is also a careful man. He will not risk his reputation or his safety on the word of an Apache, no matter how convincing the story. Then we don't tell him it's based on Kuruk's word, Lucy replied, her mind racing with possibilities. We tell him that I've been investigating the raid on my own, that I found inconsistencies in the official story. We present him with questions rather than answers. Let him reach his own conclusions. Kuruk studied Lucy's face with growing respect. You would lie to this man to help me. I wouldn't be lying, Lucy said carefully. I would be presenting him with facts and letting him interpret them. If those facts happen to come from you originally, that's not something he needs to know right away. She moved to her kitchen area and began preparing a meal, her hands busy while her mind worked through the details of her plan. Over the next several hours, the three unlikely conspirators refined their strategy. Lucy would approach Will Harper with her concerns about the raid, using her reputation as Samuel's widow and a respected member of the community to gain his attention. She would present him with the inconsistencies that Kuruk had identified, the wrong type of horseshoes, the poorly crafted arrows, the suspicious timing of the attack. If Harper showed interest in investigating further, Lucy would guide him toward Eagle's Peak, ostensibly following her own amateur detective work. Once they discovered Kuruk's evidence, Harper would have no choice but to acknowledge that the official story was flawed. And if Harper could be convinced to pursue the real perpetrators, Kuruk might have a chance at justice rather than a lynching. Maria volunteered to stay with Kuruk while Lucy was gone, both to continue his medical treatment and to serve as a witness if Sheriff Bradley returned early. If the sheriff comes before you return, she told Lucy, I will tell him that you have gone to town for more medical supplies. It may buy you a few extra hours. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the cabin windows, Lucy prepared for what might be the most important conversation of her life. She changed into her best dress. The blue calico that Samuel had always said brought out her eyes and pinned her hair back in the severe style that made her look older and more serious. If she was going to convince a cautious rancher to risk his reputation on her theories, she needed to look like someone worth taking seriously. Before leaving, Lucy knelt beside Kuruk's bed one final time. The Apache warrior's fever had broken completely, and though he was still weak from his injuries, there was strength returning to his voice and clarity in his dark eyes. If this plan fails, she said quietly, if Harper won't listen or if we can't find enough evidence, what then? Kuruk reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Then you will have done more for me than any white person ever has, he said simply. And I will face whatever comes with the knowledge that not all of your people are ruled by hatred and fear. He squeezed her hand gently. But I do not think this plan will fail, Lucy Ann Dalton. You have the heart of a warrior and the mind of a strategist. If anyone can find justice in this place, it is you. Lucy felt tears prick at her eyes at his words, at the faith he was placing in her abilities. She had never thought of herself as particularly brave or clever, just a woman trying to survive in a harsh land. But Kuruk's confidence in her gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. As she rode toward Will Harper's ranch in the gathering dusk, Lucy reflected on how much her life had changed in just 2 days. 48 hours ago, she had been a lonely widow working her homestead in isolation. Her biggest concerns centered around her cattle and her vegetable garden. Now she was embarking on a desperate mission to prove an Apache warrior's innocence while uncovering a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to save Kuruk's life, she had found something that had been missing from her own existence for years, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival. For the first time since Samuel's death, Lucy felt truly alive, her mind sharp and her heart full of determination. Whatever the cost, she would see justice done. Will Harper stood in his ranch yard, splitting firewood in the fading light when Lucy's horse emerged from the evening shadows. The weathered rancher set down his axe and studied her approach with concern etched across his lined face. Lucy had ridden hard from her homestead, and both she and her mount showed signs of urgent travel. Something in her posture, in the set of her shoulders, told Harper that this was no social visit. "Evening, Lucy," Harper called out, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "You're riding mighty late for a neighborly call. Everything all right at your place?" His eyes swept over her, taking in the determined expression and the way she sat her horse, like someone on a mission of utmost importance. Lucy dismounted and tied her horse to the hitching post, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the urgency she felt. "Will, I need to talk to you about something important," she said, her voice carrying a gravity that made the rancher straighten with attention. "It's about the silver mine raid. And I think there are things about it that don't add up the way folks are claiming they do." Harper's expression grew cautious, his eyes darting toward his house, where lamplight glowed in the windows. "Lucy, that's not really something for civilians to be poking into," he said carefully. "Sheriff Bradley and Captain Morrison have that investigation well in hand. Best to let the proper authorities handle such matters." But Lucy had anticipated this response and came prepared with her most compelling arguments. "Will, you know me," she said, stepping closer and looking him directly in the eyes. "You know I'm not given to flights of fancy or wild theories, but I've been thinking about what happened at that mine transport, and there are details that just don't make sense if it really was Apache raiders who did it." The rancher's curiosity was clearly piqued, despite his caution. "What kind of details?" he asked, leaning against his fence rail with the air of a man settling in for a longer conversation than he had initially expected. Lucy had rehearsed this moment during her ride, knowing that she would have only one chance to plant seeds of doubt in Harper's mind. "The timing, for one thing," she began, her voice gaining confidence as she spoke. "The transport left town on a Tuesday morning, following the same route it always follows. But somehow these raiders knew exactly when and where to intercept it, knew which transport would be carrying the biggest payroll of the month." Harper frowned, his weathered face creasing with thought. "Could be they'd been watching the mine operations, learning the schedule. Maybe," Lucy conceded, "but there's more. I talked to Tom Bradley's deputy about the scene, and he mentioned that the raiders' horses left very clear tracks leading north toward Apache territory. Convenient tracks, Will, almost like they wanted to be followed in that direction." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "When have you ever known Apache to leave such obvious signs of their passage?" The question struck home, and Lucy could see doubt beginning to form in Harper's mind. Apache were legendary for their ability to move across the landscape without leaving traces, to appear and disappear like ghosts in the desert. Obvious tracks leading directly toward their territory would be completely out of character. "There's something else," Lucy continued, pressing her advantage. "The arrows they found at the scene. I saw one of them when Deputy Morrison brought it to Doc Harrison to remove from the wounded guard's shoulder. The fletching was wrong, Will. Apache arrows have a distinctive pattern of feathers, but this one looked like something a white man might make if he was trying to imitate Apache work." Harper's frown deepened, and Lucy could see that her arguments were having the desired effect. "You're suggesting this whole raid was staged?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That someone wanted it to look like Apache work when it really wasn't?" Lucy nodded gravely. "I'm suggesting that someone with inside knowledge of the mine's operations, someone who knew the transport schedule and the route, orchestrated this attack to blame the Apache and justify increased military presence in the territory." She let the words hang in the evening air. "And I think I might know where to find proof." The rancher straightened, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. "Lucy, if what you're saying is true, then you're talking about a conspiracy that could involve some very powerful people. That's dangerous territory to be exploring." "I know it's dangerous, Will," Lucy replied, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her stomach. But if innocent people are being blamed for crimes they didn't commit, if someone is manipulating the situation to their own advantage while good people die, then don't we have an obligation to seek the truth? She stepped closer, her eyes burning with conviction. You're a respected man in this territory, Will Harper. People listen to you, trust your judgment. If you were to investigate these inconsistencies, officially or unofficially, you might uncover evidence that could prevent a terrible injustice. Harper was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with conflicting impulses of caution and duty. Finally, he spoke. What kind of proof are you talking about, Lucy? Where do you think evidence might be found? Lucy felt her heart race with excitement and terror. This was the crucial moment, the point where her plan would either succeed or fail spectacularly. There's a place called Eagle's Peak, about half a day's ride northeast of here, she said, trying to sound as if the information had come from her own investigation rather than from Kuruk. I've been thinking about the raiders' escape route, and if they really went north like the tracks suggest, they would have had to pass through that area. There are caves up there, places where someone might cache stolen goods or hide evidence of their real identity. Harper's eyes sharpened with interest. You want me to ride up to Eagle's Peak with you to look for evidence of this conspiracy? The idea was clearly both intriguing and terrifying to the cautious rancher. Not just the two of us, Lucy said quickly. We should take a few trusted men, make it official. If we find what I think we might find, we'll need witnesses. People whose word will carry weight with Sheriff Bradley and Captain Morrison. She paused, playing her final card. Will, if I'm wrong about this, the worst that happens is we waste a day riding around the mountains. But if I'm right, and we do nothing, an innocent man might hang while the real criminals go free. The appeal to Harper's sense of justice proved effective. After another moment of internal struggle, the rancher nodded slowly. All right, Lucy. I'll organize a small search party for first light tomorrow, but I want your word that if we don't find anything substantial, you'll drop this investigation and let the proper authorities handle the matter. Lucy felt a surge of triumph, but also a growing sense of the enormous risks she was taking. You have my word, Will, she said, extending her hand to shake on the agreement. And thank you for trusting me enough to look into this. As Lucy rode back toward her homestead in the darkness, her mind raced with plans and contingencies. She had successfully convinced Harper to investigate Eagle's Peak, but now came the more dangerous part of her scheme. She needed to return to her cabin, check on Kuruk's condition, and prepare for what might be the most important day of her life. The night air was cold against her face as she urged her horse faster along the familiar trail. Behind her, Harper's ranch grew small in the distance, and ahead lay her own homestead, where an Apache warrior trusted her with his life and freedom. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. When Lucy arrived at her cabin, she found Maria Santos sitting by the fireplace, her weathered hands busy with some sort of needlework. The Mexican woman looked up as Lucy entered, her dark eyes immediately reading the tension in Lucy's face. "How did it go with Harper?" she asked without preamble. "He's agreed to search Eagle's Peak tomorrow with a small party of men," Lucy replied. Hanging up her coat and moving to check on Kuruk, the Apache warrior was awake, propped up against pillows, his color much improved from the morning. The fever had broken completely, and though he was still weak from his injuries, there was alertness in his dark eyes that gave Lucy hope. "The rancher Harper, he is a man of honor?" Kuruk asked, his English still careful but growing stronger with use. "He will not betray your trust when he learns the truth about how you came by this information." Lucy considered the question seriously. Will Harper was indeed a man of honor, but he was also a product of his time and place, shaped by years of frontier violence and racial prejudice. How he would react when he discovered that his investigation was based on information from an Apache warrior was impossible to predict. "I think he's a good man who wants to do the right thing," she said finally. "But you're right to be concerned. If we find the evidence and it clears your name, Harper will want to know how I knew where to look. When that moment comes, we'll have to trust that the truth will be enough to overcome his prejudices." Maria looked up from her needlework, her expression troubled. "There is something else you should know," she said quietly. "While you were gone, I made a trip to town for more medical supplies. I heard troubling news at the trading post." She set down her sewing and faced Lucy directly. "Captain Morrison has sent word to Tucson. The Apache hunters will arrive within the week." The news hit Lucy like a physical blow. Apache hunters were brutal men who killed for bounty money, who would torture their victims for information before claiming their scalps for payment. If they arrived before Kuruk's innocence could be proven, he would face a fate worse than hanging. "How much time do we have?" Lucy asked, her voice tight with controlled panic. "Perhaps 5 days, maybe 6 if the weather slows their travel," Maria replied. "But Lucy, there is worse news. I also heard that Sheriff Bradley has been asking questions about your activities, about who has been seen coming and going from your homestead. Someone has told him about my visits here." Lucy felt the walls closing in around her. If Bradley suspected that she was harboring Kuruk beyond the agreed-upon time limit, he might return with a larger force before Harper's investigation could bear fruit. Every moment that passed brought them closer to disaster. "We need to accelerate our timeline," she said, thinking aloud. "If Harper finds evidence tomorrow that supports our theory about the staged raid, we need to act on it immediately. We can't afford to wait for a formal investigation or legal proceedings." Kuruk struggled to sit up straighter, wincing at the pain in his injured leg. "Lucy Ann Dalton," he said seriously, "you have already risked everything to help me. I will not ask you to risk more. If the Apache hunters are coming, perhaps it is better that I try to escape now while I still have some strength. I can travel if you will help me to my horse." "Absolutely not," Lucy said firmly. "You can barely walk, let alone ride hard enough to outrun professional hunters. And even if you could escape, the real criminals would still be free while you spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder." She moved to the window, peering out into the darkness as if expecting to see hostile figures approaching. "No, we see this through to the end. We find the evidence, we expose the truth, and we clear your name properly." Maria nodded approvingly. "The girl speaks wisdom, Kuruk. Running now would only confirm your guilt in the minds of many, and it would leave Lucy to face the consequences alone. Better to fight for justice while we still have allies and opportunities." The 3 conspirators spent the remainder of the night planning for the next day's expedition. Lucy would meet Harper and his men at dawn, guiding them toward Eagle's Peak while maintaining the fiction that her knowledge came from independent investigation. Maria would remain at the homestead with Kuruk, ready to help him escape if the worst happened. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through the cabin windows, a new complication arose. The sound of multiple horses approaching fast sent all 3 of them into alert silence. Lucy peered carefully through her window and felt her blood run cold at what she saw. Sheriff Bradley was returning, but not alone, and not at the leisurely pace of a man confident in his authority. He rode at the head of a group of 6 armed men, all pushing their horses hard as if responding to an urgent summons. Even more alarming was the presence of a figure Lucy didn't recognize. A tall man in an expensive suit who rode with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "It's Bradley, and he's brought company," Lucy whispered urgently to her companions. "Maria, get Kuruk into the root cellar quickly. Whatever happens, they cannot find him here." As Maria helped the wounded Apache warrior to his hiding place beneath the cabin's floorboards, Lucy tried to prepare herself mentally for what was coming. The early arrival of the sheriff's party could only mean one thing. Someone had betrayed her, had informed the authorities about her activities. But who, and how much did they know? The sound of boots on her porch was followed by a thunderous knock that seemed to shake the entire cabin. "Lucy Ann Dalton." Bradley's voice boomed through the door. "Open up in the name of the law. We have a warrant to search these premises." Lucy took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and opened the door with what she hoped was an expression of innocent surprise. "Why, Sheriff Bradley?" she said, her voice carefully modulated to sound confused and slightly indignant. "What brings you here so early and with so many men?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Bradley's face was hard as granite, and Lucy could see suspicion burning in his eyes. Behind him stood his deputy and 4 other men she didn't recognize, all armed and looking as if they expected trouble. But it was the tall man in the expensive suit who commanded her attention, his cold blue eyes studying her with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. "Mrs. Dalton," the stranger said, stepping forward with the confidence of authority. "I am Judge Cornelius Whitmore of the Territorial Court. We have received information that you are harboring a fugitive Apache warrior in violation of territorial law and in direct defiance of Sheriff Bradley's explicit instructions." His voice carried the cultured tones of an educated man, but there was steel beneath the politeness. Lucy felt her world shift beneath her feet as she recognized the name. Judge Whitmore was one of the men Maria had identified as potential beneficiaries of continued conflict between Apache and settlers. His presence here, leading the search for Kuruk, confirmed her worst suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy she had stumbled into. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." "Judge Whitmore," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I've been alone here since the sheriff's last visit, tending to my homestead and recovering from my ordeal in the river rescue." She stepped aside to allow them entry, knowing that resistance would only confirm their suspicions. But as the armed men began their search of her cabin, Lucy realized that her careful plans were unraveling with terrifying speed. The evidence at Eagle's Peak would mean nothing if Kuruk was captured or killed before it could be retrieved. And worse, the presence of Judge Whitmore suggested that the conspiracy reached even deeper into territorial government than she had imagined. Sheriff Bradley moved through her small cabin with methodical precision, overturning furniture and checking every corner while his men spread out to search the barn and outbuildings. Lucy watched with forced calm as they rifled through her personal belongings, tossing aside letters from her late husband and family photographs in their search for evidence of her supposed crimes. The violation felt almost as terrible as the fear that gnawed at her stomach. "Finding anything interesting, Sheriff?" Judge Whitmore asked, his cultured voice carrying an undertone of impatience. He remained near the door, clearly considering himself above the physical work of searching, but his cold blue eyes never left Lucy's face. "Mrs. Dalton seems remarkably composed for a woman whose home is being searched for a dangerous fugitive." Lucy forced herself to meet Whitmore's gaze directly, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "I've done nothing wrong, Judge," she said quietly. "I saved a drowning man from the river, provided basic medical care, as any Christian would, and allowed Sheriff Bradley to take him into custody when his 2 days were up." The lie came smoothly, rehearsed during the sleepless hours of the previous night. Deputy Morrison emerged from the barn, his young face flushed with exertion and frustration. "Nothing in the outbuildings, Sheriff," he reported. "No signs of recent habitation, no Apache gear or weapons." He glanced at Lucy with barely concealed suspicion. "But that doesn't mean he wasn't here and moved on." Judge Whitmore stepped closer to Lucy, his presence intimidating despite his refined appearance. "Mrs. Dalton, we have it on good authority that the Apache warrior Kuruk has been seen in this vicinity within the last 24 hours. We also have reports of suspicious activity at your homestead, including the presence of known Apache sympathizers." His smile was cold and predatory. "Surely you understand that harboring a fugitive is a serious crime, punishable by imprisonment and loss of property." Lucy felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air, but she maintained her composure. "I don't know who might have given you such information, Judge, but it's simply not accurate. I've been alone here since Sheriff Bradley's last visit, working my land, and trying to recover from the trauma of nearly drowning in that river rescue. She gestured around her ransacked cabin. As you can see, there's no place here to hide anyone, and certainly no Apache warrior. Sheriff Bradley completed his search of the main room and moved toward the kitchen area, his heavy boots echoing ominously on the wooden floor. Lucy's heart hammered as he approached the area directly above the root cellar where Kuruk and Maria were hidden. The entrance was well concealed beneath a throw rug and a heavy wooden chest, but a thorough search might reveal its existence. "Sheriff!" one of the other men called from outside. "We found fresh horse tracks leading away from the property, heading northwest toward the Badlands. Looks like maybe 2 or 3 riders moving fast." The man appeared in the doorway, his weathered face grim. "Tracks are maybe 6 hours old, hard to say for certain." Judge Whitmore's eyes lit up with satisfaction. "Excellent work, Patterson. It appears our fugitive has indeed been here, but has fled when he learned of our approach." He turned back to Lucy, his expression triumphant. "Mrs. Dalton, I'm afraid those tracks constitute evidence of your complicity in harboring a wanted criminal. You will need to come with us for formal questioning." Lucy felt panic rising in her throat, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Hold on there, Judge Whitmore," Will Harper said, as he rode into the yard with 3 of his men. "What's all this commotion about?" "I came by to collect Lucy for our planned survey of the northern range, and I find her place crawling with armed men." The arrival of Harper and his men shifted the dynamic in the cabin dramatically. Harper was a respected figure in the territory, a man whose word carried weight, even with territorial judges. His presence forced Whitmore to adopt a more careful approach, to justify his actions rather than simply imposing his authority. "Mr. Harper," Judge Whitmore said smoothly, extending his hand in a gesture of collegial respect. "How fortunate that you're here. We're conducting an investigation into Mrs. Dalton's alleged harboring of the Apache fugitive. Guruk, perhaps you can shed some light on her recent activities and associations." Harper's weathered face remained carefully neutral as he shook the judge's hand, but Lucy could see the sharp intelligence in his eyes as he assessed the situation. "I'm afraid I can't tell you much about Mrs. Dalton's activities, Judge," he said slowly. "She keeps to herself mostly, works her land, tends her cattle. Seemed like a respectable widow woman to me." He paused, his gaze moving between Whitmore and Bradley. "What evidence do you have that she's been harboring fugitives?" Sheriff Bradley stepped forward, eager to justify his actions to a man of Harper's standing. "We have witness reports of suspicious activity, Will. Apache sympathizers coming and going at odd hours, signals being sent toward the hills. And now we've found fresh tracks leading away from the property." Harper nodded thoughtfully, but Lucy could see skepticism in his expression. "Witness reports can be unreliable, Tom," he said carefully. "People see what they expect to see, especially when there's fear and tension in the air. As for tracks, well, Lucy has neighbors and visitors just like anyone else." He turned to Lucy with what appeared to be casual concern. "You mentioned a survey of the northern range, Mrs. Dalton. Are you still planning to show me those grazing areas you thought might be suitable for expanding my herd?" Lucy felt a surge of hope as she realized that Harper was providing her with an alibi and a reason to leave the property. "Of course, Mr. Harper," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've been looking forward to showing you those meadows near Eagle's Peak. The grass there is particularly good this time of year." Judge Whitmore's eyes narrowed at the mention of Eagle's Peak, and Lucy wondered if she had made a tactical error. But Harper seemed oblivious to any significance the location might have, nodding in apparent satisfaction. "Excellent. Then if Sheriff Bradley has finished his search and found nothing, perhaps we can proceed with our business." The judge and sheriff exchanged glances, clearly frustrated by this turn of events. They had expected to find Kuruk hidden at the homestead, or at least clear evidence of Lucy's guilt. Instead, they had found only suspicious but inconclusive tracks and the testimony of a respected rancher vouching for Lucy's character and activities. "Mrs. Dalton," Judge Whitmore said finally, his voice carrying a warning undertone, "you are not to leave the territory without permission from this court." And if we discover that you have been less than truthful about your recent activities, there will be serious consequences. The territorial government takes a dim view of those who aid and abet Apache raiders, Lucy nodded meekly, playing the role of a chastened but innocent woman. Of course, Judge Whitmore, I understand completely, and I assure you that I have nothing to hide. She moved toward the door, eager to escape before the searchers discovered the root cellar.
Will, shall we proceed with our survey?
The morning light will be best for evaluating the grasslands. As the group prepared to leave, Sheriff Bradley made one final attempt to uncover evidence. Judge, shouldn't we search the root cellar before we go? That chest looks like it might be covering something. Lucy's blood ran cold, but Harper intervened before Bradley could act. Tom, I've known Lucy Dalton for years, and I can vouch for her character absolutely. If you haven't found anything by now, you're not going to find anything. Besides, we have legitimate business to conduct, and the day is getting away from us. His tone carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Judge Whitmore hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to conduct a more thorough search and his need to maintain good relations with influential men like Harper. Finally, political pragmatism won out. Very well, he said reluctantly. But Mrs. Dalton, remember that you remain under suspicion. Any further evidence of wrongdoing will result in immediate arrest and prosecution. As the officials mounted their horses and prepared to leave, Lucy felt a mixture of relief and terror. She had managed to protect Kuruk and Maria for the moment, but the reprieve was temporary. Judge Whitmore's presence at the search confirmed her worst suspicions about the corruption surrounding the silver mine raid. But it also meant that the conspiracy had resources and authority that would be difficult to combat. Harper waited until the official party was well out of earshot before speaking. Lucy, he said quietly, I don't know what's really going on here, but it's clear that you're in serious trouble. That business about tracks and Apache sympathizers, it's got the smell of a setup to me. His eyes were grave with concern. If you're involved in something dangerous, something over your head, this might be the time to tell me about it. Lucy felt tears of gratitude well in her eyes at Harper's obvious concern for her welfare. Here was a man who barely knew her, who had no obligation to help her, yet who was willing to put his own reputation at risk to protect her. The temptation to tell him everything, to share the burden of her secret, was almost overwhelming. Will, she said carefully, what would you say if I told you that I believe there's a conspiracy to blame Apache for crimes they didn't commit, and that some very powerful people are profiting from the continued conflict between settlers and natives? Harper's expression grew very serious. I'd say that's a dangerous accusation to make without rock-solid evidence to back it up, he replied. But I'd also say that there are men in this territory who would sell their own mothers if the price was right. If you've stumbled onto something like that, Lucy, you need to be very, very careful who you trust. The weight of his words settled over Lucy like a shroud. She was walking a tightrope between justice and destruction, with the lives of innocent people hanging in the balance. But as she looked at Harper's honest, weathered face, she made a decision that would change everything. Will, she said quietly, I think we need to have a very long conversation on our way to Eagle's Peak, and I think you need to know why I really suggested that particular location for our survey. The ride to Eagle's Peak took them through some of the most treacherous terrain in the Arizona Territory, a landscape of red stone canyons and wind-carved mesas that seemed to guard their secrets jealously. Will Harper rode beside Lucy in thoughtful silence for the first hour, his 3 ranch hands trailing behind at a respectful distance. The morning sun climbed steadily higher, casting long shadows across the desert floor and painting the distant mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Lucy's mind raced as she considered how much to reveal to Harper and when. The rancher had already shown himself to be a man of principle by protecting her from Judge Whitmore's search. But asking him to believe that territorial officials were staging Apache raids for profit was a different matter entirely. One wrong word, one detail that sounded too fantastic to believe, and she could lose his support completely. Lucy, Harper said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Back at your homestead, when Judge Whitmore mentioned Eagle's Peak, I saw something change in his expression. That wasn't the look of a man hearing about a location for the first time. He turned in his saddle to face her directly. What aren't you telling me about why we're really riding out here?" The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Lucy had expected, but she recognized the wisdom in Harper's observation. Judge Whitmore had indeed reacted to the mention of Eagle's Peak, and a man of Harper's experience would naturally notice such details. There was no point in maintaining her deception any longer. "Will," she said, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, "what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible at first. But I need you to hear me out completely before you make any judgments." She paused, choosing her words with careful precision. "The Apache warrior Kuruk, the one they're hunting for the silver mine raid, he's innocent. Not only innocent, but he was investigating the real perpetrators when he was injured in the flood." Harper's weathered face remained carefully neutral, but Lucy could see the skepticism in his eyes. "Go on," he said simply, his tone giving away nothing of his thoughts. "The raid wasn't conducted by Apache at all," Lucy continued, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "It was staged by white men who wanted to blame the Apache, men who profit from continued conflict between settlers and natives. Guruk found evidence of this conspiracy, and he was on their trail when the spring floods swept him into my life." The rancher rode in silence for several minutes, processing what she had told him. Lucy could almost see the thoughts churning behind his weathered features as he weighed her words against his own observations and experiences. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that hadn't been there before. "Lucy, what you're suggesting is that some of our own people, white settlers or officials, murdered 2 transport guards and stole that silver to frame the Apache," Harper said slowly. "That's not just a crime, that's treason against everything we're trying to build in this territory." He paused, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks ahead of them. "If you're right about this, it means we can't trust our own law enforcement, our own courts. It means the system itself is corrupted." Lucy felt a surge of hope at the seriousness in Harper's tone. He wasn't dismissing her claims out of hand, wasn't treating her like a hysterical woman with wild theories. Instead, he was grappling with the implications of what she was telling him, working through the logic and the evidence. "There's more, Will," she said, pressing her advantage. "Judge Whitmore, the man who searched my homestead this morning, he's one of the conspirators. He owns large tracts of land that become more valuable when the government offers homestead incentives to encourage settlement. Continued Apache raids justify increased military spending and federal investment in territorial development." Harper's expression darkened at the mention of the judge's involvement. "Whitmore's been pushing hard for expanded military presence in the territory," he admitted. "Last month at the Territorial Council meeting, he gave a long speech about the need for more federal funds to combat the Apache threat. Said that without proper protection, settlers would abandon their claims, and the territory would never achieve statehood." "And who benefits from that federal money?" Lucy asked rhetorically. "The contractors who supply the army, the merchants who sell goods to new settlements, the officials who award the contracts and collect fees for their services. It's a web of corruption, Will, and innocent people are dying to keep it profitable." The group rode on in contemplative silence, the desert landscape gradually giving way to the foothills of the mountain range that dominated the northern horizon. Lucy could see Eagle's Peak in the distance now, a distinctive rock formation that rose like a stone sentinel above the surrounding terrain. Somewhere in the caves and crevices of that peak lay the evidence that could prove Kuruk's innocence and expose the conspiracy that threatened to tear the territory apart. As they approached the base of the mountain, Harper called for a halt. "Before we go any further," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command, "I need to know exactly what we're looking for and how you came by this information. If we're about to accuse territorial officials of conspiracy and murder, we need evidence that will stand up to the closest scrutiny." Lucy dismounted and walked to the edge of a small stream that trickled down from the mountainside, using the time to gather her thoughts and prepare for the most difficult part of her revelation. When she turned back to face Harper and his men, her expression was resolute. "Will, the information about Eagle's Peak came from Kuruk himself," she said, her words falling like stones into the silence. "He's been hidden in my root cellar since Judge Whitmore's search this morning. He's alive, he's recovering from his injuries, and he's been helping me piece together the truth about the silver mine raid." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Harper's 3 ranch hands reached for their weapons, their faces hard with suspicion and anger. "You've been harboring a murdering Apache?" One of them snarled, his hand resting on his gun butt. "Lady, that makes you as guilty as he is," but Harper raised his hand, calling for calm. "Easy, boys," he said, his voice carrying a warning. "Let's hear what Mrs. Dalton has to say before we start making accusations." He turned to Lucy, his weathered face grave. "Lucy, I hope you understand what you're telling me. You've admitted to a federal crime, harboring a wanted fugitive. If you're wrong about his innocence, if he really was involved in that raid, you could hang right alongside him." Lucy met Harper's gaze steadily, drawing strength from the conviction that burned in her heart. "Will, I've looked into that man's eyes. I've seen his character, heard his story, watched him conduct himself with honor and dignity, even when he was at death's door. He's no more guilty of raiding that silver transport than you are." She gestured toward the peak above them. "But if my word isn't enough, then let's find the evidence he says is hidden up there. Let's see what the truth looks like when it's laid bare in the sunlight." The climb to the caves near Eagle's Peak was treacherous, requiring them to lead their horses along narrow trails that clung to the mountainside, like precarious scratches in the stone. Lucy's legs ached from the effort, and more than once she found herself grateful for Harper's steady hand, helping her across particularly difficult passages. The air grew thinner as they climbed, and the wind carried a chill that spoke of the approaching winter. After nearly 2 hours of careful ascent, they reached a ledge where several cave openings yawned like dark mouths in the rock face. Harper studied the area with the practiced eye of a man who had spent his life reading the land, noting the signs of recent passage and the strategic advantages of the location. If someone wanted to cache stolen goods or hide evidence of their activities, this would be a good place for it, he admitted grudgingly. Difficult to reach, easy to defend, with good sightlines in all directions. He turned to Lucy with renewed interest. "Which cave are we supposed to search?" Lucy tried to remember Kuruk's exact words, his description of the hiding place he had discovered during his investigation. "The third opening from the left," she said, pointing to a cave that was partially concealed by fallen rocks. He said it was marked with a symbol carved into the stone, something that looked like a lightning bolt struck by an arrow. One of Harper's men, a lean cowboy named Jake Morrison, scrambled across the rocky ledge to examine the cave entrance. "There's something here, boss," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "Looks like fresh carving in the rock, just like she described." The group made their way carefully to the cave entrance, where Morrison's discovery sent a chill through Lucy's bones. The symbol was exactly as Kuruk had described it, a crude but unmistakable mark that seemed to pulse with sinister meaning in the shadows of the overhang. Harper examined the carving with interest, running his weathered fingers over the fresh cuts in the stone. "This wasn't made by Apache," he said with certainty. "The style is all wrong, and the tool marks suggest it was carved with a white man's knife, not traditional native implements." He looked up at Lucy with growing respect. "Your Apache friend knows what he's talking about. This is definitely a marker of some kind." The interior of the cave was larger than it had appeared from outside, with several chambers branching off from the main entrance. Harper's men lit torches from their saddlebags, casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls as they began their systematic search. Lucy felt her heart pounding with anticipation and fear as they worked their way deeper into the mountain's heart. It was Morrison who found the cache, hidden in a crevice behind a pile of carefully arranged stones. "Boss, you need to see this," he called out, his voice tight with excitement and disbelief. "There's a whole arsenal back here, and it ain't Apache weapons." Harper and Lucy rushed to Morrison's position, where the cowboy had uncovered a collection of items that made Lucy's blood run cold. There were military-issue rifles with their serial numbers filed off, boxes of ammunition that bore army markings, and most damning of all, a leather satchel filled with correspondence and documents. Harper examined the papers by torchlight, his expression growing darker with each page he read. "Sweet Jesus," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Lucy, you were right about everything. This is correspondence between Judge Whitmore, Captain Morrison at the fort, and someone named Blake, who runs the territorial supply contracts." He looked up at her with a mixture of admiration and horror. "They've been planning this for months, orchestrating raids and blaming them on Apache to justify increased military spending." Lucy felt a mixture of vindication and revulsion as Harper continued to read from the documents. The conspiracy was even more extensive than she had imagined, involving not just the theft of silver, but a systematic campaign to provoke war between settlers and Apache for the profit of a few corrupt officials. "Look at this," Harper said, holding up a particular letter that made his hands shake with anger. "It's from Captain Morrison to Judge Whitmore, dated 2 weeks before the silver mine raid. He's asking for confirmation of the target and the timing, making sure the blamed Apache tribe will be one that Whitmore wants removed from valuable mineral lands." One of Harper's other men, a grizzled veteran named Pete Collins, had been examining the weapons cache. "Boss," he called out, "these rifles, I recognize some of these serial numbers. These are weapons that were reported stolen from the fort's armory 3 months ago. Captain Morrison claimed they were taken in an Apache raid on a supply wagon. The pieces of the conspiracy were falling into place with terrifying clarity." Lucy realized that they were looking at evidence of not just one crime, but a pattern of systematic deception and murder stretching back months or possibly years. The men responsible had been using their positions of authority to orchestrate violence and profit from the fear and hatred it generated. Harper gathered up the most incriminating documents and stuffed them into his saddlebags. "We need to get this evidence back to town immediately," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "But we also need to be very careful about who we show it to. If this conspiracy reaches as high as we think it does, presenting this evidence to the wrong person could get us all killed." Lucy felt a surge of hope, mixed with terror, as they prepared to leave the cave. They had found the proof they needed to clear Kuruk's name and expose the conspiracy, but they had also uncovered evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. The men responsible would not hesitate to commit more murders to protect their secrets. As they began their descent from Eagle's Peak, Harper outlined his plan for how to proceed. "We'll take this evidence to the territorial marshal in Phoenix," he said. "He's federal authority, outside the local chain of command that's been corrupted. But it's a 3-day ride, and we'll need to be careful not to alert Whitmore or Morrison that we're onto them." "Will," Lucy said as they carefully navigated a particularly treacherous section of trail. "There's something else you need to know. Captain Morrison has sent for Apache hunters from Tucson. They'll arrive within the week, and when they do, they'll kill Kuruk whether he's guilty or innocent. We don't have 3 days to ride to Phoenix." Harper's face went pale at this information. "Then we'll have to move faster than I planned," he said grimly. "We'll ride hard for Phoenix tonight, change horses at way stations, and get this evidence to the marshal before those hunters arrive. It's our only chance." But as they reached the base of the mountain and prepared to mount their horses for the desperate race to Phoenix, Lucy saw something that made her heart stop with terror. A column of dust was rising in the distance, moving steadily toward Eagle's Peak. Through Harper's field glasses, she could make out the figures of mounted men, at least a dozen riders moving with the purposeful urgency of a military patrol. "It's Captain Morrison," Harper said grimly, lowering the glasses. "He's coming with a full squad of soldiers. Someone must have told him where we were going." He turned to Lucy with grim determination. "Lucy, we've been betrayed. Someone in town knew about our plans and warned the conspirators. We're trapped. The standoff at Eagle's Peak stretched across the desert floor like a scene from a fever dream, with Captain Morrison's cavalry unit spread in a wide arc to prevent any escape, while Harper's small group took defensive positions behind the rocky outcropping at the mountain's base. Lucy crouched behind a boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the blue uniformed soldiers dismount and prepare their weapons. The evidence they had discovered in the cave felt like a burning weight in Harper's saddlebags, so close to justice, yet potentially useless if they all died in this God-forsaken place. Captain Morrison rode forward under a white flag, his weathered face a mask of military discipline that couldn't quite conceal the desperation in his eyes. He was a man whose career and freedom depended on silencing the witnesses to his conspiracy, and Lucy could see the calculation in his posture as he approached their position. "Will Harper," Morrison called out, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air, "I'm ordering you and your people to surrender immediately. You're harboring a known Apache raider and interfering with a military investigation." Harper rose from behind his cover, his own rifle held ready, but not directly threatening. "Captain Morrison," he replied, his voice steady despite the odds against them, "I think you know why we can't do that. We've found some very interesting documents in that cave, correspondence that I believe you're familiar with." Morrison's face went pale at Harper's words, confirming what Lucy had already suspected. The captain's presence here wasn't coincidental. He had known exactly where to find them, because he had been monitoring their investigation from the beginning. Lucy stepped out from behind her own cover, the damning correspondence clutched in her hands. "Captain Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even herself, "I'm holding a letter in your own handwriting, dated 2 weeks before the Silver Mine raid. In it, you're asking Judge Whitmore for confirmation of the target and timing." The effect of her words was electric. Morrison's soldiers exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence in their mission clearly shaken by this revelation of their commander's possible corruption. Several of them began to lower their weapons, unwilling to kill civilians to protect a potentially criminal conspiracy. "That's enough," Morrison snarled, his military composure finally cracking under the pressure. "Sergeant Rodriguez, take a squad and secure those documents by force." But before the sergeant could move, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Captain," came the calm, authoritative tone of Federal Marshal James Whitfield as he rode into view with a contingent of territorial marshals. "We've been monitoring your activities for some time now, and I believe Mrs. Dalton has evidence that will be very relevant to our investigation." Lucy felt her knees nearly buckle with relief as she recognized the federal authority that Harper had been trying to reach. Marshal Whitfield was a legendary figure in the territory, a man whose reputation for honesty and competence was matched only by his determination to root out corruption wherever he found it. Morrison's face went ashen as he realized that his conspiracy had been exposed at the highest levels. "Marshal Whitfield," he said, his voice cracking with desperation, "these people are harboring a dangerous Apache raider. They're interfering with military justice." Marshal Whitfield dismounted and walked calmly toward Lucy, his weathered face kind but implacable. "Mrs. Dalton," he said gently, "I believe you have some documents that might shed light on recent events in this territory. Would you be willing to share them with federal authorities?" Lucy felt tears of gratitude streaming down her face as she handed over the correspondence and evidence they had discovered. "Marshal," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "everything we found is here. Letters, weapons, ammunition, all of it proving that the Silver Mine raid was staged by corrupt officials." As Marshal Whitfield examined the documents, his expression grew increasingly grave. "Captain Morrison," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of federal law, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, murder, theft of government property, and treason against the United States, but the drama was far from over. Even as Morrison was being restrained, Judge Whitmore arrived on the scene with a group of armed civilians, his expensive suit incongruous in the desert setting, but his intentions unmistakably hostile. "Marshal Whitfield," he announced in his cultured voice, "I demand that you release Captain Morrison immediately. This is a territorial matter, not a federal one." Marshal Whitfield turned to face the judge with a smile that held no warmth whatsoever. "Judge Whitmore," he said pleasantly, "how convenient that you should arrive just as we're discussing your correspondence with Captain Morrison. I have here a letter in your handwriting discussing the division of profits from staged Apache raids and illegal land seizures." Whitmore's carefully constructed facade crumbled as he realized that his entire conspiracy had been exposed. "You have no proof of anything," he blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. The tension ratcheted up to an almost unbearable level when from the rocks above their position came the distinctive sound of Apache war cries, followed by the appearance of a dozen painted warriors led by an imposing figure that Lucy immediately recognized as Chief Nalnish, Kuruk's father. The Apache had been watching the confrontation unfold, waiting for the right moment to intervene. Before violence could erupt, another voice joined the chorus, speaking in fluent Apache and then switching to English. It was Kuruk himself, somehow having escaped from Lucy's homestead and tracked them to Eagle's Peak. "My father," Kuruk called out, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air, "these white people speak truth. The woman Lucy saved my life and proved my innocence." Chief Nalnish studied the scene below with the wisdom of a leader who had survived decades of frontier warfare. When he spoke, his English was heavily accented but clear. "My son speaks truth?" he asked, his dark eyes fixed on Lucy with penetrating intensity. Lucy felt the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders as she stepped forward to address the Apache chief directly. "Chief Nalnish," she said, her voice steady despite her fear, "your son is innocent of the crimes they accused him of. White men staged those raids to blame your people and steal your land. We have proof." The chief listened intently as Kuruk translated Lucy's words and added his own account of recent events. Finally, Chief Nalnish nodded and spoke again in English. "The woman Lucy has honor," he declared, his voice carrying across the desert like a pronouncement of fate. "She saved my son when she could have let him die. The Apache people will remember her courage." Marshal Whitfield, recognizing an opportunity to prevent bloodshed and achieve justice simultaneously, stepped forward. "Chief Nalnish," he said respectfully, "if your people will allow federal law to take its course, I give you my word that the real perpetrators of these crimes will face justice." The chief conferred briefly with his warriors before responding. "We will trust the word of the federal marshal," he said finally, "but we will also watch to ensure that justice is truly served." With the immediate threat of violence diffused, Marshal Whitfield was able to complete his arrests. Judge Whitmore and Captain Morrison were both taken into federal custody, along with several of their accomplices who had been identified through the correspondence found in the cave. As the various groups prepared to depart Eagle's Peak, Lucy found herself face to face with Kuruk for the first time since his rescue from the river. The Apache warrior looked stronger than when she had last seen him, his injuries healing well despite the ordeal of tracking them across the desert. "Lucy Ann Dalton," he said formally, using her full name as he had that first day in her cabin. "I owe you a debt that can never be repaid. You risked everything to save a stranger, to protect someone your own people called enemy." Lucy felt tears threatening again as she looked at this man whose life had become so intertwined with her own. "You don't owe me anything, Kuruk," she said softly. "We helped each other when help was needed. That's what decent people do." Kuruk reached into his shirt and withdrew something that made Lucy gasp with surprise. It was a small silver pendant, intricately carved with symbols that seemed to blend Apache and Mexican artistic traditions. "This belonged to my grandmother," he said, placing it gently in Lucy's hands. "She who loved this land where you now live. I want you to have it as a reminder that some bonds transcend the divisions that others would create between us." Lucy accepted the pendant with reverence, understanding that she was receiving not just a gift, but a symbol of trust and respect that crossed all cultural boundaries. "I'll treasure this always," she promised, fastening the pendant around her neck where it rested beside her heart. Chief Nalnish approached them, his stern features softened by what might have been approval. "Lucy Dalton," he said, "you have shown that not all white settlers are ruled by greed and hatred. My people will remember this, and you will always be welcome in Apache territory." As the sun began to set over the Arizona territory, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, the various parties began their journeys home. Marshal Whitfield departed with his prisoners, and bound for Phoenix and federal courts, where justice would finally be served. In the weeks that followed, the trials of Judge Whitmore, Captain Morrison, and their co-conspirators became the sensation of the territory. The evidence Lucy and Harper had discovered proved overwhelming, and all three men were convicted of conspiracy, murder, and treason. The Apache, vindicated by the revelations and grateful for Lucy's intervention, agreed to a new peace treaty that established clear boundaries and trading relationships. Kuruk served as one of the translators and negotiators, his experience with both cultures making him invaluable in bridging the gap between two peoples. On a crisp autumn morning 6 months later, Lucy stood in her garden, tending to the vegetables that would see her through the coming winter. The silver pendant Kuruk had given her caught the sunlight as she worked, a constant reminder of the bonds that had been forged in the crucible of crisis and courage. A familiar voice called her name, and she looked up to see Kuruk approaching on horseback, his bearing proud and free. He dismounted and walked toward her, his face showing the full health and vitality that had been restored since his vindication. "Lucy Ann Dalton," he said with a smile that transformed his entire face. "I bring news from the territorial capital. The new governor has appointed you as an official liaison between the Apache people and the territorial government, recognizing your unique role in bringing peace to this land." He paused, his dark eyes warm with affection and respect. "They want to know if you will accept this position." Lucy felt her heart swell with pride and purpose as she considered this unexpected honor. To serve as a bridge between two worlds, to help prevent future conflicts through understanding and communication, seemed like the perfect culmination of everything she had experienced. "I accept," she said simply, her voice ringing with conviction across the desert landscape that had tested and transformed her. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the Arizona territory and accompanied by a friend whose life she had saved and who had saved hers in return, Lucy Ann Dalton understood that she had found her true calling. The promise she had whispered to a drowning Apache warrior by a raging river had become something greater than she had ever imagined, a covenant of justice and understanding that would endure for generations to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.